So, Luke 17, it's pretty obvious to me that Jesus hopes that we will follow him. Of course, for that to happen, back then and even now, things have to change. People have to change. And our faith is a big part of that. Faith is dynamic. On a certain level, our faith ebbs and flows, and it changes with the circumstances of life, right? Sometimes we are painfully aware of its absence, and we are dismayed. Other times in life, we are gratefully aware of its presence, and it comforts us. If we're being straight with ourselves, we all have faith in something, and we long for our faith to be found valid and to be fulfilled and to lead us in right paths. We want to increase our faith, and much of what we do as people helps us to increase our faith in whatever it is in life where we may find our faith. We do a lot of sometimes weird things to try to show our faith. Recently, I got to be a part, and I'm still a part of Leadership Pensacola. I don't know if y'all have heard of it, but myself and about 39 other people are in this thing called LEAP. The city puts this on. It's about leadership. It's about Pensacola. It's about us having faith in our community. So, of course, when you throw 40 people together who don't know each other, what better way to increase our faith in one another than to do awkward low ropes courses together? To get hot and sweaty outside. And that is precisely what we did. We went to the University of West Florida. We went out into the woods there on their campus, and we did something called the Trust Fall. Does anybody know what the Trust Fall is? If you've ever been to Camp Simatonga or maybe Blue Lake, you know what the Trust Fall is. So here I am with these people in this group. I've just literally met them today. And one of the things that we were asked to do was the Trust Fall. So here's how this works. Someone gets up on a high podium, about as high as a person, and they stand facing away from all the people, and everybody else below them lines up, waiting to catch this person. And the person up on the pedestal has to cross their arms, and they have to fall backwards, and they have to trust that these random strangers are going to catch them. I didn't do the Trust Fall, by the way, just so you know. But it was a great exercise in learning how to trust other people. Faith is something that you build. It's something that you work on. And it is something that we work on with other people. It has to grow. It has to adapt. It has to change. However, on the other hand, faith is not simply a matter of our own strength, and instead is something gifted by God. Paul tells the Ephesian church in chapter 2, he says that our faith is not our own. And the church is encouraged to receive faith as a gift from God. So here in Luke 17, the disciples ask for more faith. Now, I asked Sam to begin this scripture kind of in the middle. There are several verses before it, and there are several verses after it. But we begin in verse 5 with the disciples asking for more faith. You would think that Jesus would graciously respond to such a request in a wonderful way, right? Oh, you want more faith? Well, zip, there you go. Here's more faith. But that is not how Jesus responds in Luke 17. Instead, Jesus gives a sharp response that the disciples don't seem to get. Jesus' response seems to imply that the disciples haven't really understood what genuine faith is. So today we're going to talk about increasing our faith. Where are you placing your faith? Where are we placing our faith? Y'all, we place our faith in all kinds of things. Maybe in the stock market. Maybe in the air conditioning in our homes. Maybe you place a lot of faith in that pew. Thanks be to God. Maybe you place a lot of faith in your pants not to rupture. We all place faith somewhere. Life requires faith. And Jesus understood that the disciples and anyone who follows him, they have to rethink, they have to shift what it means to have faith in our lives. Luke 17 is pretty specific in what we should be placing our faith in and what that achieves. Now, just previous to what I asked Sam to read, Jesus admonishes his disciples to forgive as much as requested of them. The scripture says if your brother or sister comes to you and asks for forgiveness 7 times, you know how many times you're supposed to forgive them? 7 times. This ain't 3 strikes, you're out. This is perfect forgiveness, just as Jesus offers. This charge is challenging. Y'all, sometimes it's hard to forgive somebody once, much less 7 times. Now, this is comforting to those of us who know that we need forgiveness, and it should be comforting. But for us, mere mortals who have to navigate work, school, community, y'all, forgiveness, it seems like a daunting task. And the disciples are no different. They ask for Jesus to increase their faith. They assume that if they're going to pull off this forgiveness thing, what they need is more faith, greater faith to face the challenge of confronting and forgiving sin. Jesus' counter is that they may not even have faith the size of a mustard seed. This minuscule faith, Jesus says, could even tell a mulberry tree to be uprooted and planted in the sea. Now, if that image sounds silly to you, it should. Christians don't go around planting trees in the sea, do we? But we have recently seen this happen, haven't we? If you've watched the news at all, or if you've paid attention to the devastation that Hurricane Ian has brought to southern Florida and to other places, miraculously, the storm surge pushed into coastal communities and trees were planted in the sea. I want to be clear, I do not believe that the devastation wrought by this hurricane is the will of God, but I do believe it can be a metaphor for us to understand the power of God, not the power of humans with great faith. The point Jesus makes in Luke 17 is not that they need more faith, but rather that they need to understand that faith enables God to work in a person's life in ways that defy ordinary human experience. Do you hear the difference? In other words, our faith is not in what we can do, but what in God can do. Faith isn't about being some kind of magician. It isn't increased by our showmanship or by our resumes. It's not even really about performing miracles or spectacular acts of kindness. Yes, these can encourage us in our faith, but what are we placing our faith in? The disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith, and his response, borne out in a surprising way in their request, shows that even a little faith in him can help the disciples live by his teachings. Y'all, the best course of action we can take to increase our faith is to be like Jesus. And what does Jesus teach us to do in this scripture? To forgive. Jesus teaches us to forgive as we have been forgiven. God can forgive, and it creates miracles in our lives. There's a story that I love that comes out of South Africa. As they were wrestling with trying to come out of apartheid, South Africa did something called they were courts of truth and reconciliation. And the idea was that you had these people who worked in the government and in the security forces who could sit in these trials. They could confess to their sins, to how they'd wronged society and wronged their neighbors. And in so doing, in these truth and reconciliation courts, they would receive a lighter sentence. Okay, so the idea was if you could fess up to how you had done some atrocious things, then you would receive a lighter sentence. And the story goes that in one of these courts, there was a police officer who had killed a young man. And he went to the Truth and Reconciliation Court and he sat in front of the community, really, but family members even, of this young man. And he admitted to what he did. He confessed to killing this guy, kind of in cold blood. And when he was finished admitting to a murder, a woman stood up. And the story goes that this is the grandmother. And the grandmother of this young man who had died stood up and addressed the police officer and said, "Sir, you took my grandson from me. I don't have a grandson anymore, but I forgive you, and you're going to be my grandson now." That's the kind of forgiveness that changes the world, changes hearts, shows how miraculous our God can be. That's the kind of forgiveness that increases our faith. Y'all, we can forgive as Jesus forgives, and it will increase our faith. Here's where I want to confess to a little bit of a stumbling block for myself, all right? I'm just going to be a bit vulnerable with you. I sometimes am faced with the need to forgive someone. And in the face of this great challenge, I don't ask Jesus to increase my faith, but instead, sometimes when I've been in a place where I need to forgive somebody, instead I wring my hands, I stall, and I ask a big question. Why? Why? Why should I forgive this person? Instead of asking Jesus how I can forgive like him, I get trapped in the why. One particular example I can think of is I remember growing up, I had friends over at the house, a bunch of different people, and this one friend, my best friend, he's my best friend, he was playing with my toys and he broke one of them. And you know what I did? I stopped inviting Adam to come to my house. My parents said, "Do you want Adam to come over?" And I said, "Why should I let my friend come over to my house and break my toys? Why should I forgive him when he doesn't care that he broke my toys?" Thank God we became friends later in life, and it's a silly thing. We look back and we go, that was nothing, right? But we do this. I do this. I don't know if you do this, but very often when I'm approached with an opportunity for forgiveness, for offering forgiveness, instead I ask, why? Is forgiveness so important? I get trapped in the why. Sometimes I get bogged down and I cannot get past my resentment. I can't get past my bitterness. I can't get past my lack of faith. And so instead I ask, why? But Jesus in this passage, he doesn't go that direction. Do you notice that Jesus doesn't say anything about why in this passage? Instead, Jesus pays a lot more attention to the how. The second part of this scripture affirms that forgiveness is not found in the why. Forgiveness is found in the how. And how we forgive is pretty straightforward. Scary simple even sometimes. Now, for Jesus, the disciples are expected to offer forgiveness, and that how is so apparent to Jesus that he jumps right past it and he makes an argument that regardless of how much we do, we cannot do more than is expected of us. And what is expected of us is not to ask why. What is expected of us is to act in the how of forgiveness. Now, I want to point out that Jesus leans really hard into the understandings and customs that controlled servants in the first century. Unfortunately, a lot of the Roman world and a lot of Jesus' world involved slaves. And I don't believe that Jesus is condoning the practice, but he instead appeals to this logic that people knew, that his listeners would have understood at that time. First, they're asked to understand the perspective of a servant, of a master. In Jesus' artful way, he shifts the perspective then to that of the servant. And the disciples are challenged in Luke 17 to see that they are God's servants. And therefore, even when they do all that is required, they've done nothing for which they weren't expected to do. Y'all, we may have done nothing for which we might expect to be rewarded, but we certainly have done a lot of things for which we hope that God will pay out. Right? And Jesus, in this biting moment in Luke 17, he says, you know what? Once your heart's in the right place, once you have faith the size of a mustard seed, what's really important is not what comes later, but that you've acted, that you've done what is expected of you. Jesus counters that when we're in a place of faith, then what God does and how we join God's work, that doesn't require a whole lot of faith. Just faith the size of a mustard seed. Here's my truth bomb for you today. If you want to take anything away from this, if all of the rest of it doesn't make any sense, let me tell you something you're going to find true in your life. It takes way less faith to answer why than it does to answer how we forgive. The kind of faith we need is worried less about why and more worried about how. My brother was fortunate enough to be a journalist in Demopolis, Alabama. Huge place, right? He got to talk to a lot of people as he was a journalist. He would go to a lot of sports games. He'd be in the community. And so my brother, as a journalist, Jerry, got to go around and talk to people about their experiences. And once in a while he was in Demopolis, he would get to interview people after some big crazy thing happened. One time there was a car accident, car was on fire, dude gets pulled out of his truck, and my brother got to interview the person who saved him. There's another time there was a student at a high school football game who took a bad hit and was injured, and he got to talk to the people who cared for him afterwards. And what my brother said is that when you interview people for a newspaper and you ask people, why did you do it? They all say the same thing. Why did you pull that man out of that burning car? Why did you help that student after that bad hit in that football game? They say the same thing. It's just what I ought to have done. It's what people do. It's what anyone would have done. My brother said that over and over when he would interview these people, they would be like, I'm just some normal guy. This is Demopolis. What if Christians approached things that way? What if we just did what we were supposed to do? I really do hope that the scripture is comforting for you. Because what it says is that what is expected of you is simply what you can do. Nothing more, nothing less. What if we just do what we are supposed to do? What if what is expected of you is within your grasp? We can increase our faith by doing it and discovering a God that can uproot trees and plant them in the sea.